December 24th, 1944. Bastogne. In a cellar smelling of damp wool and burned coffee, a voice in the dark said what a lot of them believed. "You'll never knock out a tank with that." The line drew low laughter. Outside, fog had killed the sky. No thunderbolts, no marauders, no rescue from above. The infantry was naked. On a ridge west of town, Sergeant Joseph Rogan and Corporal Rest O'Brien lay in snow watching shapes that shouldn't be there, white smudges riding pale hulks. German tanks in bedsheets, threading through the trees. Behind them, field artillery. The old fear said, "Artillery is slow. You call, you wait, you hope they heard you right. You hope the Germans don't hit first." What the men in the cellar didn't know, what the Germans threading tanks through the fog couldn't have imagined, was that within 12 hours, those guns would stop 18 panzers at the rifle line, not from miles away, from 500 yards, direct fire, eye level. The phone calls would be faster than the tanks. By dawn, German prisoners would tell interrogators the same thing. The American artillery was the worst of it. December 16th, the German attack slammed into the Ardennes and pushed the front into a white maze. The weather killed the sky first. No thunderbolts, no marauders, no easy rescue from above. On the ground, it was men, wire, and artillery, with the old fear attached. Artillery is slow. You call, you wait, you hope they heard you right, you hope they don't hit you. You hope the Germans don't hit first. Corporal Al Levy knew the sound of waiting. He was a forward observer with the 288th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, a small man with dentist's hands who could sketch an entire streetscape from memory. He wore his nerves neat. Even so, the winter frayed them. The screaming memes, German rockets that made the hair on your neck walk around by itself. The bitter cold that turned canteens into paperweights and radios into sullen furniture. The farmhouse where the blast came in and took the door with it. Down in the basement were the medics. One of them, Levy could still hear it, was making a sound he could not map to any organ he knew. Levy put his head around the corner and said, "I can help if you need me," because that is what he knew how to say when he was out of his depth. With the snow still drifting into the hallway, he went back to the window and his binoculars and the map board and the pencil stub and the net. He kept doing the job because artillery, when it's fast and called right, rearranges the battlefield faster than panic can. Levy and men like him, observers who learned to hide their rank bars with mud, who crawled forward with handsets that reached fire direction centres with clocks on the wall, were the sinew connecting fear to precision. The enemy hunted them because glass and metal caught the eye. If they died, the machine that kept their friends alive stopped working. By the second day of the offensive, the fear wasn't just about Germans, it was about being cut off from the sky. Fog erased the habit of expecting help from above. Infantry, who'd grown used to the buzzing comfort of fighter bombers, looked at the low ceiling and tried not to say out loud that they were naked. Word spread fast of companies overrun, not by wonder weapons, but by weight, panzers, and men walking in the dark. The old rumour that artillery would take forever, that it would splash short, that it would come late, or not at all, uncurled in the back of everyone's mind like a bad habit. In that empty sky, the guns had to be perfect. The thing about fear in winter is that you feel it twice, once when you think about what might happen, and once when your fingers won't do what they're told. Levy saw crews warming breech blocks with their breath, phone lines wrapped around trees like garland, because the wire wanted to snap like glass in the cold. The effect of a net that worked. An observer 60 yards back from a pinned company, calling a grid he's memorised more surely than his own birthday. Shot. Splash. 4 men exhale together. The shell lands where the grid said it would. The second round lands where the correction said it should. "Fire for effect," someone says. And the infantry stop counting seconds. They start counting yards. In the first week, the Germans were loud and early. The Americans were cold, and then they were methodical. The fog was supposed to be Germany's ally. It turned out to be a ceiling for something else, the kind of weather that explodes in sequences, measured not by propellers but by stopwatches. Heat in algebra. December 19th, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion rolled into Hemrul and anchored a piece of the Bastogne Ring. Their guns clanked into fields that farmers had just learned to live through. The men set up tents that turned to blocks of ice when the breath in them froze. The locals went back inside when the first registration rounds laid a geometry across the fields you could hear but not see. The fear didn't vanish, but it got met by drills, by nets, by a discipline that made the guns feel like a friend that answered on the first ring. By the 21st, another decision was forming. Ammo grew scarce, the fight got close, and some crews started eyeing lengths of hedgerow with a new kind of interest. If the tanks came, the guns would drop trails and fire direct. It was an ugly thought and exactly right for a winter where everything had to do more than it was built to do. That possibility, artillery as a wall at the edge of a field, sat there in the cold, waiting to be used. By Christmas Eve, the nets were tuned like a piano before a concert. On a ridge west of town, Sergeant Joseph Rogan and Corporal Rest O'Brien lay in snow that had hardened like plaster, watching shapes that shouldn't be there, white smudges riding pale hulks. The cellarmen kept the coffee hot. The maps were clean. The phones were ready to be wrong and then right. The tanks had not yet arrived. But the ridge could feel them coming. Snow does that. It tells you when something heavy is deciding to move. December 19th, 24th. Bastogne. On the west side of the pocket, the 463rd settled its guns like teeth in a jaw. The snow did the soundproofing. A gun crew trotted past a tethered horse with wheels for a collar. Somewhere in town, a Christmas hymn tried and failed to rise above the crack of axes. The air smelled like wet rope and cordite. Private. William Stone carried the radio that tied the line to the guns. He was a radio man with the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion on loan forward to an observer team. Stone had the flattened affect that comes from carrying things other men depend on. His hands were always a little dirty from changing batteries. He slept with the handset on his chest like a rosary. In the dim light you could see the call signs written on tape along the set's edge, a little phone book of salvation. Adjust fire. He learned to say it like he meant it. The FO would mark the target in the curt grammar of the net. Infantry in the open. Then the grid, the direction, the distance, the method. The FDC repeated it back once and made the math not sound like math. Sine and cosine turned into deflection and quadrant. Drift turned into a fine correction that snatches around from the wind and drops it on a boot-sized patch of ground a mile away. The FDC was a room that never raised its voice. It wrote on plastic with a grease pencil because paper tears too easily when the air shakes. The perimeter taught the system new tricks every hour. Pre-registration points the infantry could see had a different weight than the ones they could only feel in their bones. A lieutenant learned to ask for smoke and then HE, and to do it in one breath before the lines swallowed his words. The net got faster the way a conversation does when you stop explaining yourself. Stone would key the handset and hear half of a sentence from 3 different mouths and know which one was meant for him. It is a skill you cannot teach. You only learn it by trying not to die. Hemmerl's FDC used the minutes before dawn to clean the board, erase corrections, and leave the grids like stencils. The operations officer, Garrett, who never said more than the net needed, moved little wooden markers around on a map, the way a child does when he learns that the pieces are supposed to mean people. Inside the map case lived an ugly possibility. If the tanks came, the guns might become tank destroyers. Someone had scrounged a few heat rounds, not enough to sleep easy. In the meantime, the crews rehearsed the heresy of dropping trails, yanking the guns around with ropes, and sighting at a farmhouse door like it was an animal's chest. By the 21st, the decision wasn't theory anymore. Ammunition had to be rationed, and rationing begets priorities. The 463rd had come up with the habit of answering every ring if the infantry asked, the guns would talk. Now the guns started asking questions before they answered back. How many? How close? What's your left and right limit? Can you wait? The paradox of good artillery in winter is that speed depends on patience. Stone filled the half-second between shot and splash with silence the infantry could believe in. In that half-second, men would hold a trench like a borrowed coat. Numbers live in the background of battles, but sometimes they step forward and put a hand on your shoulder. By Christmas, The battalion's chalkboard already held a number shaped like a slope, thousands of rounds since the 19th, a clean arc that meant the line had a heartbeat. The number also meant something harder. The ammo trucks wouldn't be able to climb that slope forever. The FDC didn't preach about it. It just looked for ways to make 100 shells fight like 200. At the rifle line, that economy was felt in every call. The pre-registered final protective lines carried names, crude nicknames that made them easy to remember in the middle of being afraid. Plough line, barn roof, 3 stumps. If the Germans stepped to a certain fence post, an entire battery could be made to speak at once. Artillery doctrine likes to say massed fires, and that phrase hides how human the massing is. It is 2 men who agree on the same fence post and trust each other not to blink. In the evenings, Stone visited the gun pits because the battery cooks were generous and the gun crews were bored when not moving. Battery D's chief, Capt. Victor Toffany, was the kind of man who would make a quiet inventory of the items to be burned if the line broke, code sheets, maps, the black book with frequencies, and then go get the men hot tea like he hadn't just inventoried the end of the world. Lieutenant John Cooper, the battalion commander, had the odd power to be everywhere at once without anyone being able to say how. The older sergeants would teach you to sight on the glow of a cigarette instead of the cigarette itself. Stone slept next to the radio with the handset's cord around his wrist so nobody could take it. The ring around Bastogne wasn't a wall. It was a cat's cradle. It held because of knots. A flare from the 401st GIR, a call from Rogan's post on the ridge, a math problem in Hem Rule, and a round that falls like a hard opinion right where a German lieutenant just told his men to run. The knot shows itself when a prisoner later says the American guns were the worst of it. When an infantryman goes from saying, if the guns come to, when the guns come, without noticing he changed tenses. December 24th, near midnight, west of Bastogne. The ridge had the slow heartbeat of men who were trying not to fog their optics. Rogan and Bryan spoke in syllables, so the handset wouldn't pick up breath noise. 100 yards behind them, Corporal William Everhart crouched in a shallow scrape with a spare handset and the notebook that made sense of everybody else's. Downslope, 2 stands of trees sat 50 yards apart, like sleepy sentries. Between them ran a depression the Germans would later swear was a road. It wasn't. It was a good guess in bad visibility. The tanks threaded themselves through the guess. Their paint was hidden under frost and the whitewash of winter improvisation. On their decks rode infantry, wrapped in sheets. A farm dog saw them and did what dogs do when they are asked to understand war. It whined until its owner held its muzzle shut. Rogan saw crosses and muzzle breaks and stopped whispering. He spoke the grid and the direction like the world had one axis. Shot, came back, flat as a shrug. Splash, he said, and counted. The first round punched snow to the right of the left-hand wood. Drop, he started, and Bryan finished it with the correction as if they were finishing each other's sentence. Fire for effect, said the voice that never raised itself, and the ridge stopped being quiet. The shells were invisible. The trees flinched like someone grabbed them by the shoulders. The tank riders stood up where they sat, and then they were not there. Hold what you've got, Garrett told the net. Don't chase the picture with your fire. Let the picture chase you into the bracket you've already built. The tank in front nosed left like an animal smelling a trap and found one. A battery in Hem Rule shaved 30 yards off a calculation and stitched the depression shut. Men on foot discovered that snowdrifts make poor cover against mathematics. The TDs coughed twice from under their nets and then went quiet, because what the guns were doing was louder than a diesel engine in a church. The rifle company on the ridge wore its fear differently now. Minutes earlier, they were making the promises men make when it is dark. They will stand. They will not be moved. If they are moved, they will come back in anger. Then the guns started writing sentences the infantry could read from their bellies. The company stopped promising and started aiming. What came back from the enemy was what always comes back when men walk into a bracket. Not a coordinated counter, but motion. People moved because they had to. Some slid off the tanks and crawled. Some ran and were slower than the corrections. Some lay where the snow said lie still. A man in white stood up where there was no reason to stand and raised his arms stiffly as if to ask the air to explain itself. The air explained itself like thunder. "Lift 200, Rogan said, and the map in Hemrule adjusted to the living bodies on the ground without caring who they were. Faces tell the story in these moments because the sound becomes a weather report, tuned out to stay sane. Brian's pencil left a grey smear across the page, where his hand shook once and then steadied. The smear looked like a bayonet that had been dragged across a floor. Everhart, farther back, repeated the corrections into a second handset like a man repeating a prayer out loud to convince himself that he meant it. Stone listened for other calls on the net and filtered out pleas that weren't for his guns. Garrett kept his voice calm, the way a doctor does when he wants a patient to believe the worst part is over. 2 hours of this. The ones who laugh when the shell they trimmed lands exactly where they said it would. The ones who go silent and stay that way for a day. The ones who talk too much, because if they stop talking, they will have to listen. At about 3 in the morning, Rogan used the phrase he hadn't wanted to use, "We're overrun," not as a complaint, but as a geometry lesson. The line between him and friendly machine guns had enemies walking across it. His voice didn't climb. The net answered with something colder than courage. Hold fire until you can see the muzzle brakes. The order wasn't about caution. It was about making the short-range picture match the pre-registered map so those last rounds would buy yards, not drama. On the gun line, men kicked ice off wheels and dropped trails. A howitzer is not supposed to snipe. With the right sight picture and a gunner who has been arguing with recoil his whole adult life, it can be taught to. Someone yelled, "Heat!" and got a look from a chief that said, "Do not waste the rarest thing we own on a guess." They loaded HE and aimed where the road would have to be if the tanks wanted to live through dawn. The first direct fire shot in anger is an education. The flash blinds the gunners for a heartbeat. The shell crosses a field that is too small to be called a battlefield and connects with a square of geometry the size of a panelled door. When it hits, the tank's skin jumps like a drumhead. Close enough. It registers in teeth before ears finish their report. The crew inside is doing math with heat and smoke. The tank slows. The second shot finds the seam by memory. The third one is not Christian. The ridge found a new word for morning: mercy. The firing stops for 20 seconds and somebody sobs because he didn't realize he'd been holding his breath for 10 minutes. The FO team drank that mercy in sips. "Lift left," Rogan said. "Shift right." The bracket moved like a zipper, closing across the depression. A moment arrives when the enemy decides this ground is not worth what it is costing them. It registers in the shoulders the way a tug-of-war rope slackens. Even with the bracket working, shapes kept moving. The first tank starts to burn. New problems, light, smoke, silhouettes for other tanks to aim at. The work continues. The sound of gears screaming when a driver puts a gearbox designed for farms into a corner he can't steer out of. Imagining keeps men from thinking too hard about what the HE is doing to men in white sheets. When dawn finally started to colour the smear of the ridge, nobody on the net said Merry Christmas. They said repeat. They said correction. They said on. The ridge, which had looked like an unremarkable rise in the snow the day before, now looked like a place the world had decided to punish. The stands of trees were shorter by a third. The depression that wasn't a road had become a new drainage, smooth as poured lead. And still the ugly thing waited. If the tanks pushed into the last 100 yards, the guns would aim at eye level and do the work that infantrymen hope never to watch up close. Back in the cellar, the voice that had joked about knocking out tanks didn't joke anymore. It ladled coffee and listened to the net. Laughter got rationed like ammo, save for the moment when you can afford to admit you are still here. December 25th, 1944, Bastogne. Light came late and dirty, the kind that doesn't give you shadows so much as the sense that things have edges again. On that first edge, the tanks showed themselves, whitewash sloughing off in wet streaks, crews hunched in turrets like men trying to hear through winter. In the FO's glass, they were close enough to count bolts. Distance, 500 to 600 yards, too near for preferences, perfect for decisions. Hold, Garrett said again. And then, fire. The bracket walked like a marching band across the depression. What had looked like certainty from the German side became math they could not argue with. A tank's front slope can shrug dumb luck, it cannot shrug an equation repeated with cruelty. Brian tracked the left-hand edge like a man drawing a curtain. Rogan said, "On." Everhart echoed from the pit. The battery chiefs confirmed from their guns the closest artillery ever gets to a hymn. At the gun line, the crews dropped trails and locked the housings like men bracing a door. One gun picked its aim point where a fence post had frozen into a pillar. Another used the lip of a culvert that the crews had sighted on at dusk exactly for this moment. He did work that a classroom diagram would call overpressure. A turret cracked from a weld, not a design flaw, but a designer's grief. After the second round, the third is mercy, even if it looks like hatred. Fire it, because if the crew climbs out, they should climb out without the gun in their hands. Tank riders learned the lesson of speed. At 500 yards, there's no outwalking the time of flight of a corrected round. Men jumped and fell and crawled in white that turned to grey where the dirt came up. Machine guns on the ridge stitched lanes through the smoke where the artillery wasn't working at that instant, but the artillery took most of those lanes back as soon as a voice said, "Lift," or "Drop," or "Right 5." The company on the ridge began to move, not like men in crisis, but like men in a drill. Good gunnery takes panic and shapes it into competence. One tank did the smart thing. It turned away from the bracket and tried to run the lip of the field to find a hole. It reached the boundary of what artillerymen like to pretend they don't do and met it. A howitzer pointed like a rifle at a target close enough to smell. The gunner had built the sight picture in his head and now met it in public. The shell took the tank through the nose. The world hiccuped. The engine died. The crew climbed out with hands up, and an artilleryman, euphoric and incredulous, would later drive that tank back like a man delivering a borrowed car. Direct fire is a rumour until the second gun does it. The second gun did it. The third gun fired not at a tank but at a small knot of men who looked like they had lived their whole lives in snow and suddenly remembered they were from other places. HE found them. The FO banked the bracket right to keep the pressure on. The TDs fired twice again and killed what was brave enough to try a flank. Somewhere behind this, a runner with a coffee urn did the honest work of winter. He made the men look up and take a sip so their hands would stop shaking. Numbers came back to the FDC by way of glances, counted silhouettes through smoke. 1, 2, 5, more. The FO did not count out loud because he was busy. The battalion chalkboard would get the number later. It would say that none of the 18 tanks survived the day. The ridge would remember fewer because memory keeps only what it can carry. The official count would also note the oddity with the captured tank because artillery borrowing a language that doesn't belong to it gets written down. The fight leaked into the rest of the morning and then into the afternoon. There were pockets in the second stand of trees where men who had not been hit decided to discover whether the world had any corners left to hide in. The FO team found them with smoke first, an old trick that still works because men who can't see will move and men who move can be measured. The rifle company worked forward step by step, and each step felt like a return of something nobody could name. At the guns, the grind asserted itself. Trails up, trails down. A gun that had found glory at 500 yards went back to lobbing precise boredom at a copse where someone had reported an MG position. A chief scolded a loader for bending a pin with his cold hands. A corporal cursed a lanyard that had frozen as stiff as a stick. The ammo detail played accountant with shells, stacking by fuse and intent in neat pyramids that made a geometry of scarcity. If anyone said the words, "saved the day," he said them after sundown and not very loud. In the early afternoon, a prisoner from the morning's push told an interrogator through a translator a sentence that would get passed around the perimeter like a canteen. The American artillery was the worst of it. On the chalkboard, it sits right next to the number of expended rounds and looks like math. The men on the ridge treated it like weather. Of course it was. They'd felt it in their teeth. By the time the sun did its brief winter trick of pretending to set at noon, the FO team had stopped using the word overrun. The net went back to the normal rhythm of a siege, short fights, shorter silences. And yet, the morning hung in the air like the smell of cordite that never quite leaves. Stone wrote a note to himself on a scrap of paper and tucked it inside the radio. Check handset cord. He meant something else. Check your connection to the world you want to live in tomorrow. The handset cord held, so did the ridge. Christmas afternoon brought the thing nobody had planned for. A sergeant from the gun line drove the captured tank into Hemrul with a grin so wide it looked like a wound. He parked it where the civilians could see it and then climbed down, remembering, suddenly, that he was a man with chapped knuckles and cold feet and not a cavalry officer from a painting. Someone took his picture with a borrowed camera. Somebody else went back to the board and added another slash to the tally, because even miracles need arithmetic to stay honest. By the end of the day, the number on the board looked like certainty. The fuel on the snow looked like oil paintings done with a broken brush. The infantry on the ridge looked a year older than they had at dawn. The FO team looked exactly the same to anyone who didn't know where to look. The hands and the eyes told the story. The hands shook less when they picked up the handset. The eyes did not look as far away as they had the night before. When darkness came, it came like relief. The ridge exhaled. The men in the cellar ladled coffee onto the same jokes and found they still worked. In the FDC, Garrett sat down for the first time in hours and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Then he stood again and checked the board, because a man who lives with radios knows that the world can come undone between sips. Late December, Bastogne. In the week since the 19th, the number of rounds fired by the 463rd had risen into the thousands. 7,676 rounds by New Year's Eve. Break that down per gun, per day, per target type, and it would still be what the infantry felt in their ribs. A correctness that kept coming back whenever it was asked for. The chart on the FDC wall looked like a cardiogram. The line was arcing up exactly where a heart should beat hard. Numbers do not bleed, but the men who make them do. Somewhere else on the line, a battalion recorded a measure that became legend. 32 of 48 forward observers casualties in 6 days. The ratio of courage to necessity. Men like Levy and Rogan believed the handset was a safer place for their fear than their own heads, and they paid for that belief with odds no insurance company would write. The pattern held as the pockets squeezed tighter. Fire direction centres coordinated massed fires the way a conductor makes a section hold a note. On New Year's Eve, 12th Corps threw weight across multiple sectors at once. An FO with the 945th said later that he could hear the Germans screaming in the woods. Mass fires do that to men who are sure they will live until they suddenly are not. By early January, the fog's bargain began to shift. The proximity fuse, the one engineers had built as if to give clocks teeth, started to be used more broadly in the ground roll. Airbursts stitched the ceiling of wood lines into a net that cut men down whether they ran, resisted, or froze. At night, riverbanks became theatres where the enemy played the part of men with nowhere to go. The guns had made a promise and kept it. Not that they would always be there, but that when they were, they would be fast enough and right enough to make it not matter that the sky had gone missing. The reverse of fear is not bravery, it is competence. Competence, multiplied by clocks, becomes speed. Speed, married to scale, becomes something that terrifies men who thought they were the ones who brought terror with them. What happened at Hemrul on Christmas morning was not an accident. It was a proof. And the proof was about to be tested again, in a different kind of dark. Early January, reports from multiple sectors repeated a phrase in different accents, the U. S artillery stopped the tanks at the rifle line. At Hemrul, that sentence sounded like a description of a morning. In the official versions, it was the closest anyone could come to admitting that something had changed in how an army lived. Groupments, massed fires gathered from wherever you could steal a tube were no longer a theory. They were a reflex. Prisoners kept delivering the same melody with different lyrics. The guns were accurate, fast, inescapable. Airplanes could be avoided by crawling into a hedgerow. The artillery found the hedgerows and made them pay rent. What proximity did in January was arithmetic with a new variable. Airbursts flicker in the canopy, and the air itself becomes the weapon, while the trees become scenery. Along the Sour, the night sky lit in white coins over the far bank, and men died under a ceiling they could not shoot down. January 18, Corporal Thomas Tucker shoved off in a boat full of engineers. He was crossing a black river while other men tried to erase it with machine guns and rockets. Behind him, American guns stitched the far bank into a lattice. Airbursts popped like metal hail. In flashes, Men trying to lie flat under a ceiling. The ceiling follows when the fuse is timed right. Tucker's boat grounded in black mud. The first man in the bow slipped and came up with a curse that sounded like a prayer. Behind them, the airbursts kept a tempo that engineers could walk to. A good barrage takes the percentage of outcome that fear is allowed to control and cuts it down with math. By the time the river's mud had frozen into ruts hard as iron, the artillery's winter thesis was proven in two places that rhymed: a ridge outside Bastogne and a riverbank on the Sour. Different scenes, same math. Different enemies, same outcome. The guns were faster than the fear. Dawn on the ridge. The day after, the trees were shorter than they had been. The depression that had pretended to be a road had become a scar. A tank sat crooked against a fence post as if embarrassed to have been caught. The captured one, painted wrong for this country, wore a new kind of humility. Men walked through the field with the odd politeness soldiers adopt after loud things happen, like museum guards asking thin air not to touch the exhibits. Rogan put a hand to his eyes and found that his pupils did not need to be wider than a man's thumb anymore. Brian counted something on his fingers and then stopped counting. Everhart held a pencil that had become a sliver and finally let it break because he had carried enough fragile things through the night. On the gun line, a chief walked the trails with his hands behind his back and nodded once at each gun, the way a farmer nods at fences that did their job in a storm. Stone, who had slept 3 hours with the handset cord still looped around his wrist, woke to the sound of somebody laughing, the ragged laugh a body makes when it discovers it is still required to be alive. The town's cellar smelled the same: damp wool, burned coffee, the metal stink of a radio set that's been warm for 24 hours. The voice that had made the joke did not apologize. Coffee got poured, and to someone's surprise, it tasted like something other than fear again. A line from interrogations passed around like a blessing. The guns were the worst of it. A sergeant rode a stolen tank across a courtyard and sat there grinning like a teenager who had borrowed a machine his father could only afford in dreams. Far away, and a few weeks later, on a black river under a white ceiling, the funny fuse cut the air to size so that men in boats could land. That line belonged to them. The ridge kept its own line, and it was simpler. No one on that slope believed any more that a tank could move faster than a phone call. The phone calls were short and hard and landed exactly where they were sent. The tanks did not. The voices that said shot and splash. The hands that turned trail spikes with numb fingers. The eyes behind periscopes that had learned the patience of snow. A winter that took the sky away and forced an army to learn that speed could be built by people who do not move fast, only right. Bastogne taught one lesson. The Sour etched another. Together they proved a thing that men in wool coats in a cellar might have once laughed at. You can knock out a tank with this, but more importantly, you can knock out the attack. Under a sky that says no, with clocks and lines and quiet voices. The winter began with men who doubted the guns would be fast enough. It ended with men who knew the guns were faster than the fear.